Imagine waking up one morning to find strangers at your door. They don't speak your language. They carry weapons you've never seen. And within a generation, your entire civilization, your gold, your silver, your land, your people, all of it, gone. Now imagine this happened not to one village, not to one city, but to an entire continent. 2 continents, actually. What Spain did to the Americas between 1492 and the early 1800s is, by every measurable standard, the single largest transfer of wealth through force in all of recorded human history. Historians and economists have attempted to put a number on it. The estimates are staggering, somewhere between $5 and $10 trillion in today's money. Some scholars argue it's even higher. But this story isn't just about money, it's about how you dismantle entire civilizations to feed an empire. It's about the mechanics of extraction. It's about the system Spain built, so ruthlessly efficient, that it reshaped the global economy for centuries. And it's a story that is still unfolding today, because the world we live in right now was built on the foundation of that theft. This is the full story. Before we talk about what was taken, we need to understand what existed, because one of the greatest lies ever told about the Spanish conquest is the idea that the conquistadors arrived in a primitive wilderness and brought civilization with them. The truth is almost the exact opposite. When Columbus made landfall in the Caribbean in 1492, he stumbled upon the edge of a world that was, in many ways, more sophisticated than what he had left behind. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, modern-day Mexico City, was home to an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 people at its peak. To put that in perspective, London at the same time had around 50,000 inhabitants. Tenochtitlan had functioning sewage systems, floating gardens called chinampas that fed the entire city, a complex bureaucracy, professional markets, and a network of roads and causeways that stunned even the Spanish soldiers who came to destroy it. Hernán Cortés, writing back to the Spanish King Charles III, was so dazzled by what he saw that he described Tenochtitlan as a city more beautiful and magnificent than anything in Spain. He wrote that in 1519, right before he burned it to the ground. Meanwhile, in South America, the Inca Empire, the Tawantinsuyu, stretched over 2,500 miles along the western spine of the continent. It was the largest empire in the pre-Columbian Americas, home to somewhere between 10 and 15 million people. The Incas had built over 25,000 miles of roads through some of the most difficult terrain on Earth: mountain passes, jungle valleys, coastal deserts. They had relay runners called chasqui, who could transmit messages across thousands of miles faster than any European courier system of the time. And then there was the gold and the silver. The Incas didn't see gold and silver the way Europeans did. To them, gold was the sweat of the sun. Silver was the tears of the moon. They were sacred ceremonial materials. They decorated temples, crafted ritual objects, honored their gods. They had no concept of gold as money, no currency-based economy at all. This would prove to be one of the most catastrophic cultural misunderstandings in human history, because the Spanish had sailed across the ocean for one reason, and one reason only: wealth. The Spanish conquest was not a fair fight. It never was. And it's important to understand exactly why it was ent, because the answer reveals something deeply important about how empires are built. Cortés arrived in Mexico in 1519 with roughly 500 soldiers, 16 horses, and a handful of cannons. He was facing the Aztec Empire, a military superpower with hundreds of thousands of warriors. By any conventional logic, Cortés should have been destroyed within days. He wasn't. The reasons why he succeeded are a masterclass in exploitation. First, there was disease. The indigenous populations of the Americas had been isolated from the Old World for roughly 15,000 years. They had no immunity to European diseases: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. When Spanish contact began, these diseases spread like wildfire, racing ahead of the conquistadors themselves. Historians estimate that between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died within a century of first contact. That's somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. The deadliest pandemic in human history. And it happened almost entirely in silence, largely unrecorded, largely unremembered. Second, Cortés was a master manipulator. He understood almost immediately that the Aztec Empire had enemies: the Tlaxcalans, the Totonacs, dozens of tribes who had been subjugated, taxed, and sacrificed by the Aztecs for generations. They despised Tenochtitlan. Cortés offered them an alliance. He leveraged their resentment to build an army of tens of thousands of indigenous allies who did most of the actual fighting. The Spanish didn't conquer the Aztec Empire alone. They convinced the Aztecs' neighbors to do it for them. Third, and perhaps most devastatingly, there was the psychological dimension. Aztec prophecy held that the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl would one day return from the east. When Cortés arrived on the exact year the Aztec calendar predicted this would happen, sailing on what must have looked like floating mountains, the Emperor Moctezuma II was paralyzed by uncertainty. Was this a man or a god? His hesitation was fatal. In Peru, the story of Francisco Pizarro and the Inca Emperor Atahualpa is even more audacious. Pizarro arrived in 1532 with just 168 soldiers. He invited Atahualpa, ruler of the largest empire in the Western Hemisphere, to a meeting. Atahualpa arrived with an entourage of thousands, many of them unarmed or ceremonially dressed, expecting diplomacy. What they got was an ambush. Spanish soldiers hidden in buildings around the plaza opened fire with cannons, charged on horseback, slaughtered thousands in minutes. Atahualpa was captured alive. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary ransoms in history. Atahualpa, imprisoned by Pizarro, made an offer. He said he would fill the room he was being held in, a room roughly 22 feet long, 17 feet wide, and 8 feet high, with gold. And he would fill an adjacent room twice over with silver. All of it, in exchange for his freedom. The Spanish agreed. Over the next several months, gold and silver objects poured into Cajamarca from across the empire. Sacred objects pulled from temples, ornaments stripped from palaces, artifacts accumulated over centuries of Inca civilization. The room was filled. Historians estimate the ransom was worth somewhere in the range of $50 to $80 million in today's value, just from this single transaction. Pizarro took the gold. And then he killed Atahualpa anyway. The ransom of Atahualpa was just an appetizer. What the Spanish built next was something far more systematic, far more industrial, and far more devastating. It was, in essence, an extraction machine, a colonial economy designed from the ground up to funnel wealth from the Americas to Spain with as little cost as possible. And the centerpiece of that machine was a mountain. In 1545, in what is now Bolivia, a local indigenous man named Diego Hualpa was climbing the slopes of a steep, rust-colored mountain called Cerro Rico, the Rich Mountain. He lit a fire to keep warm through the night. When he woke up, he found that the heat had melted something out of the rock below him, something silver. What Diego Hualpa had stumbled onto was the single richest silver deposit ever discovered in human history. The Spanish called the mining city they built at its base Potosí. Within decades, Potosí became one of the largest cities in the world. At its peak, in the early 17th century, it had a population of around 160,000 people, making it roughly the same size as London or Paris at the time. Except Potosí sat at 13,000 feet above sea level in the Bolivian Andes, in a wind-blasted, freezing, oxygen-thin environment where almost nothing could grow. Everything that existed there existed for one purpose: silver. Between 1545 and 1800, the mines of Potosí alone produced an estimated 45,000 tons of silver. That silver, minted into coins called pieces of 8, flooded the global economy and became, quite literally, the world's first reserve currency. Spanish silver didn't just pay for European wars and palaces. It traveled across the Pacific to China, where it was the primary medium of exchange. It reached India, the Ottoman Empire, East Africa. Potosí silver built the first truly global economy, and it was all dug out of the earth by enslaved hands. To extract that silver, the Spanish built one of history's most sophisticated and most murderous labor systems. It was called the mita. The Incas had their own version of the mita, a system of communal labor in which citizens contributed work to the state in exchange for food, tools, and social security. It was a form of civic obligation, not unlike paying taxes with labor. The Spanish took the word and gutted everything humane about it. Under the Spanish colonial mita, every indigenous community within a certain radius of Potosí was required to send 1/7 of its male population to work in the mines for 1 year out of every 7. You didn't volunteer. You didn't choose. You were selected and you went. Failure meant punishment. For you, for your family, for your entire community. Inside the mines, conditions were almost incomprehensibly brutal. Workers descended hundreds of feet into the earth through narrow tunnels barely wide enough to crawl through. They worked by candlelight in temperatures that swung from searing near the ore to freezing near the ventilation shafts. They carried 50 to 100-pound bags of ore on their backs, up ladders made of twisted leather for hours at a time. They worked shifts of 24 to 36 hours without stopping. The ore itself was processed using mercury, a technique the Spanish introduced from European metallurgy. Workers ground silver ore into powder, mixed it with mercury on large stone patios, and then walked back and forth over the mixture for days, their bare feet absorbing mercury through their skin. Mercury poisoning causes tremors, neurological damage, organ failure, and a slow, agonizing death. Historians estimate that between 8 and 9 million indigenous and African enslaved people died in the mines and processing facilities of Potosí and the surrounding region over the colonial period. The Spanish had a saying for it. They called the road to Potosí El Camino de la Muerte, the road of death. The 16th century Spanish priest and historian José de Acosta wrote that more than 8,000 indigenous people died every year in the mines. He recorded this not as a scandal, but almost as a cost of business accounting. That's what makes it so chilling. But Potosí wasn't the only source. The Spanish were extracting gold from the Caribbean within years of Columbus's arrival. They found gold in Colombia, in Peru, in Mexico. They stripped temples. They melted down sacred objects. They forced indigenous people to pan rivers. They forced enslaved Africans, brought across the Atlantic in the millions to replace the indigenous populations decimated by disease, to work plantations and mines across the hemisphere. The Spanish crown received its cut through a system called the Quinto Real, the royal fifth. 20% of all gold and silver mined in the Americas belonged to the crown by law. The rest went to private contractors, merchants, and the church. But the crown's 20% alone was enough to make Spain the wealthiest and most powerful nation in the world for over a century. Between 1503 and 1660, historians estimate that 185,000 kilograms of gold and 16 million kilograms of silver arrived in Spain from the Americas through official channels alone. That doesn't count smuggling, which was rampant. Here's where the story gets truly global and truly fascinating from an economic perspective. All that silver flowing into Spain didn't just make Spain rich. It broke the European economy, triggered what historians call the price revolution, and set off a chain of consequences that restructured the entire global order. Between roughly 1550 and 1700, prices across Europe rose by between 300 and 500%. Wages lagged behind. The middle class, what little existed of it, was wiped out in many regions. Peasants who had scraped by now found they couldn't afford food. Landlords who rented at fixed rates found their real income collapsing. Entire economies were destabilized. Why? Because Spain was pumping so much silver into the European money supply that the value of silver itself was collapsing. More money chasing roughly the same amount of goods meant prices rose. It's one of the earliest documented examples of inflation caused by monetary expansion, and it was a case study that economists from Jean Bodin to Milton Friedman would return to for centuries. Spain itself is perhaps the most ironic victim of its own wealth. You might expect that receiving $10 trillion worth of gold and silver would make your economy invincible. It didn't. It hollowed it out. Because here's the problem with free money. You stop building things. The Spanish crown, flush with American silver, didn't invest it in manufacturing and agriculture and domestic industry. They spent it. They spent it on wars. The Italian wars, the conflict with France, the war against the Dutch rebels in the Low Countries, the Armada against England. They spent it on palaces, on the church, on prestige. They borrowed against future silver shipments and accumulated debt so fast that Spain declared bankruptcy no fewer than 6 times between 1557 and 1596 under Philip II alone. Meanwhile, the countries that received Spanish silver in exchange for goods, England, France, the Netherlands, took that silver and built industries. They built navies. They built merchant companies. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, became the world's first publicly traded corporation, backed substantially by silver flowing through European trade networks. The British East India Company followed. These were the corporate vehicles of the next wave of colonialism, and they were, in a very real sense, financed by American silver. Spain dug the wealth out of the earth. Europe's northern nations took it and built the modern world, and the Americas were left with empty mountains and mass graves. The silver also traveled east. By the late 16th century, vast quantities of Spanish silver were crossing the Pacific on the Manila galleons, massive treasure ships that sailed from Acapulco, Mexico to Manila in the Philippines, where the cargo was traded for Chinese silk, porcelain, and spices. The Chinese economy, at the time the largest in the world, had adopted silver as its primary tax currency, meaning it had an insatiable demand for the metal. Historians estimate that somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of all the silver mined in the Americas ended up in China. When the silver flows eventually dried up or were disrupted by piracy, by Spanish financial collapse, by shifts in trade routes, the Chinese economy was thrown into crisis. Some historians argue that the disruption of American silver flows into China in the early 17th century was a contributing factor in the collapse of the Ming Dynasty and the Qing conquest of 1644. The reach of Potosi silver extended from Bolivia to Beijing. That's how interconnected the world had become, and that interconnection was built on forced labor, genocide, and theft. We've been talking about trillions of dollars in global trade networks, but it's worth stopping to put human faces on this. At the moment Columbus arrived in the Caribbean in 1492, historians estimate there were somewhere between 60 and 100 million people living in the Americas. By 1600, just over a century later, that number had collapsed to somewhere between 5 and 10 million. Some regions saw population declines of 95%. Let that sink in for a moment. In the space of a single century, the Americas lost somewhere between 50 and 90 million people. To disease, yes, but also to enslavement, to forced labor. to famine caused by the destruction of agricultural systems, to the deliberate massacre of populations that resisted. The Spanish priest Bartolomé de las Casas, one of the few Europeans of his era who actually documented and condemned what he witnessed, wrote a searing account called A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies in 1542. He described Spanish soldiers killing babies for sport, burning communities alive, cutting off the hands and noses of indigenous people who didn't meet their gold quotas. He estimated that the Spanish had killed 15 million people in the Caribbean alone by the time he wrote. Las Casas' numbers may have been inflated for dramatic effect, but modern scholarship suggests he wasn't far wrong. The Spanish crown, alarmed by his accounts, issued the new laws of 1542, attempting to limit the worst abuses. But enforcement was virtually non-existent in the colonies, thousands of miles from Madrid. And then there was the slave trade. As indigenous populations collapsed, the Spanish and later the Portuguese needed labor. The solution they arrived at was the transatlantic slave trade, the forced deportation of millions of Africans to work American mines and plantations. Between 1500 and 1900, an estimated 12 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. About 1.5 million died during the crossing. Those who survived faced lifetimes of brutal labor. The wealth extracted from the Americas was not simply the product of Spanish ingenuity or imperial ambition. It was built on the bodies of two continents. So here's the question that matters most. Does any of this still matter today? The answer is yes, profoundly. There's a concept in economics called path dependency, the idea that the choices and systems established early in a region's development constrain what's possible later. The colonial economy Spain built in the Americas was specifically designed to extract wealth, not to develop local economies. Roads were built from mines to ports, not to connect communities. Institutions were designed to enforce labor extraction, not to protect property rights or build human capital. Education was deliberately withheld. A literate, informed population is harder to exploit. When the Spanish colonial system finally collapsed in the early 19th century, driven by revolutions inspired partly by the American and French revolutions, the newly independent nations of Latin America inherited this extractive infrastructure with essentially no preparation for self-governance. And crucially, they inherited extreme inequality. The encomienda system, under which the Spanish crown granted conquistadors the labor of entire indigenous communities, had created a landed aristocracy that owned virtually everything. Indigenous and mixed-race populations owned virtually nothing. When independence came, the land didn't redistribute. The aristocracy simply replaced Spanish-born peninsulares with American-born criollos, but the structure of exploitation remained almost identical. Economists Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, in their landmark book Why Nations Fail, point to the Spanish colonial legacy as a textbook example of how extractive institutions, built for short-term wealth removal rather than long-term development, can trap entire regions in cycles of poverty for centuries. Look at Bolivia today. Potosí, the city that once held the richest silver deposit in human history, is now one of the poorest cities in one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. The mountain that produced trillions in silver still towers over the city, still being mined, still being extracted, and the people who live in its shadow are still poor. The contrast is stark and deliberate. The wealth didn't stay in Bolivia, it never was meant to. Peru, Mexico, Colombia, country after country in Latin America sits on extraordinary natural resources: copper, lithium, oil, gold, silver, biodiversity. And country after country struggles with poverty, inequality, corruption, and underdevelopment. The correlation is not a coincidence. The institutions were never designed to develop these places. They were designed to drain them. In recent years, there's been a growing conversation in Latin America, in Spain, in academic circles, and in international courts about what, if anything, should be done about this history. In 2021, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador wrote a letter to Spain's King Felipe VI and to Pope Francis demanding formal apologies for the conquest and colonization of Mexico. Spain's response was a diplomatic brush-off. Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez said the Spanish government would not apologize for history, and that past events must be judged in the context of their time. It's a response that's become very familiar, and it raises a genuinely difficult philosophical question. What does accountability for historical crimes actually look like? How do you make restitution for something that happened 500 years ago? Who pays? Who receives? These are questions without clean answers. But the conversation itself is important, because for too long the history of the Spanish conquest was told primarily from the perspective of the conquerors, as a story of brave explorers, of civilization spreading to a savage world of God's work being done in dark places. The truth is far more complicated and far more devastating. What Spain did in the Americas was not simply aggressive expansion of the kind every empire in history has practiced. It was the systematic destruction of multiple complex civilizations. the extraction of wealth on a scale that staggers imagination, and the creation of economic and institutional structures that have locked hundreds of millions of people into poverty for generations. Here is what history teaches us, if we're willing to listen. Empires are not remembered for their glory, they are remembered for their costs. And the cost of the Spanish Empire, measured in human lives and civilizations erased and centuries of poverty engineered by design, are among the highest ever paid. The $10 trillion figure is almost too abstract to process. But behind every unit of that number is a person. A child who died in a mercury-soaked mine. A family torn apart by the Mita. A temple stripped of everything sacred. A language silenced. A civilization erased. And the wealth that was taken didn't just enrich Spain, it built the modern world. The trading companies, the financial systems, the global supply chains, the very concept of capitalism as we understand it today. All of it stands, in part, on this foundation. That doesn't mean you burn it down, but it does mean you understand it clearly, because you cannot build a just future on a foundation you refuse to examine. The mountain at Potosí still stands. It is still being mined. The city below it is still poor. Some debts don't disappear just because they're old.